Today we're going to talk about world building, a topic no one has ever talked about before, ever. In recent months, there seems to be this new perception in the anime community about how fantasy anime is saved, and it's all thanks to these two shows. Now, I already talked about Frieren, so now I gotta talk about the other one, Dungeon Meshi.
Dungeon Meshi.
Which is a very, very good show. Visuals good, animation good, music, characters good, comedy, oh god, the comedy. Now, I was late to the party to start watching it, but once I did, I pretty much immediately locked the fuck in and very easily let myself get engaged and lost in the world. There's like this extra level of polish that goes into this series that makes the watching experience way less frustrating compared to other fantasy stories in anime, especially the ones from the DSI. No, not this DSI. This DSI. DSI. You can probably think of some. It is subjective which anime falls into these categories, but let's be real, it's these. But my point is, Dungeon Meshi, though not an isekai, is still a leading example of a fantasy story that doesn't rely on the storytelling shortcuts and the cheat codes that DSI have taken advantage of for so many years now. The random exposition dumps, the one-dimensional character writing, and of course, the super shallow world building, both in the amount of world building done and how it's done. Almost every story's world building starts off with a template. You can think of it like the baseline where your world building begins, or just the base setting of your story. And every story has a certain degree to which they either deviate or build off of the template. For some stories, they pretty much just stick to the template. Like, let's say we're looking at a Husher Quagglump story. For this series, the template is just the real world in modern day Japan. And that's pretty much all you need to establish for the world. But it makes sense, like you don't need to do anything else. It's not that kind of story. But for the same template of the real modern world, you can also build off of it into stuff like post-apocalyptic worlds or urban fantasies like the Fate and Toaru series, which take elements from fantasies, modernize them, and throw them into modern urban settings to set up new interesting stories. But speaking of urban fantasies, let's take a look at just fantasies. The template for most fantasy worlds, as you probably know, is just D&D/JRPG fantasy world. There's been so much exposure to the generic fantasy world now that there's little point to explaining much at all, because most fantasy anime follow the very wise and accurate assumption that if you're watching Dungeon Meshi, you've probably played a video game before. So for this generic RPG fantasy template, it has all the typical shit you might expect. The setting is old as shit, there's no modern tech, there's magic and mages and mana and fantasy races and dungeons and dragons and all that other Lord of the Rings, Skyrim, Game of Thrones, Dragon Quest kind of shit going on. There are exceptions, of course, like with the most notable probably being the king of world building, One Piece, but for a very huge chunk of fantasy stories in anime and manga, this is what we get. Now, the fantasy template has its own spectrum too. Over on the left here, the prime example of fantasy anime that don't really build off the template much is, of course, DSIs. But unlike the real modern world template we just talked about, it actually is a problem. Sticking to the template on its own isn't really a bad thing. It's easy, it keeps things simple, and audiences are already prepared for it. But in my opinion, leaving this template and going somewhere else is what world building is. And for fantasy especially, that is absolutely crucial for driving a sense of curiosity and immersion with the viewer. Giving them some shit to discover and having them learn about something that they didn't actually know before is a huge driving force. But how are you supposed to do that if the world you're being shown is just the template? As in, they literally just show you the template, you're like, cool man, I already know all this, and then that's it. Nothing else. The point of world building is a couple things. One is obviously to make the story and the characters make sense, but the other is to make you give a fuck. Because if the world doesn't feel real and believable, then you as a viewer might fail to stay engaged or take the story seriously. And this leaves us with the last piece of the puzzle. The fantasy series that takes the generic fantasy template but builds off of it, makes changes to it, and just generally has a lot of thought put into it when it comes to turning this pile of generic mush into a solid and interesting foundation on which to build a great story. And a prime example of this is obviously Dungeon Meshi. There's a lot of examples where Dungeon Meshi really goes above and beyond the typical fantasy story when it comes to world building. The fact that it's very much centered around cooking and eating dungeon monsters gives the series a lot of really good opportunities to dive into the intricacies of monster biology, survival and capture tactics, cooking techniques, and the overall ecosystem of the dungeon. There's this infamous living armor episode, which if you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about, which is an amazing example of how they take an already known trope, which you could consider as something that's just by default part of the standard fantasy template, which is living armor, and really twist it around to make it really cool and interesting, and to deliver on a joke from the episode before about eating metal. I've been talking about the importance of world building for fantasy stories like Dungeon Meshi, but the other part of it, and what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this video, is not the fact that the series does really good world building, but rather how the series does world building so well. And that's with a really great thing they do that I like to call natural world building. I think in order to achieve good world building for fantasy stories, there's a really delicate balance, because the more you deviate from the template, the more shit you need to explain, otherwise the story won't make sense. And for Ryoko Kui, the author of Dungeon Meshi, she needs two things. One is a cool world. Check. But the second thing is a good way to present the information without being fucking boring. Think about how we learn information in real life. For most people, unless you're a fucking nerd, if you sit down in a classroom and the teacher or professor just yaps at you for an hour about random shit, you're gonna forget most of it. Not just because it's a lot of stuff, but because it's delivered kind of unnaturally. Your brain is being forced to take in information that it doesn't know what to do with. But Dungeon Meshi takes a different approach with its natural world building. This was the number one thing I noticed when watching the show, how easy it was to follow everything. How I was just learning about the world and actually retaining all that information without wanting to fucking drown myself. Let's look at the first episode as an example with one of the most important world mechanics in the entire story, the concept of resurrection. Oh, and by the way, because I'm actually talking about the show now, I'm going to try to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible. I'm going to be referring to some stuff that happens in later episodes, but even then, I'm going to keep it to fairly non-spoilery content. So you should be good, but in case you're sensitive to spoilers, because not everyone agrees on what a spoiler is, then I'd recommend coming back after watching the show. You fucking baby. Starting from episode 1, our main characters are fighting a dragon and getting absolutely pooped on. So Fallen, one of the party mages, does a /TP for the party to escape to the surface while sacrificing herself and getting munched on. So now the remaining party members need to go back and save her before she turns into poo. Wait, what? Save her before she turns into poo? I mean, yeah, that's weird, but like, you'd think that doesn't make any sense. She's fucking dead, right? There shouldn't be anything to save. Our first hint at this is as indirect and natural as it gets. The moment Laios and Marcille wake up and start talking about Fallen being eaten, there's a reaction. But it's not really the type of reaction you'd expect. They're acting kind of more like, oh shit, I left my bag in the car, instead of, oh shit, my sister's probably fucking dead. And then they immediately go into talking about how the party's broke and hungry and how 2 of the party members just resigned. It's just a bunch of shit that you'd think would be secondary to the tragedy that just took place. And at this point, while I was watching, I was definitely thinking like, so did you guys just like hate her or something? Like, was she annoying? Like, what the fuck's going on? Why do you not care? And only a bit after this do we get our first actual direct hint. Okay, so we know that this world has resurrection now. That's how this whole plot makes sense. People don't die when they are killed. And this mechanic is a very important thing to understand. It basically fuels the entire main plot going forward. But Dungeon Meshi introduces it with a very naturally delivered line of dialogue about poo. We only know that resurrection exists and that it doesn't work if you've been digested. That's it. We don't know how it works or why it works because we don't need to. That would probably feel kind of out of place in a conversation like this if the characters, who probably all already know about how resurrection works on a basic level, just launched into a random explanation about it. Because a key component of natural world building is characters that consistently talk like they actually live in the world and only share information that makes sense to share in that moment. The next mention also isn't a direct explanation. It's again weaved into the natural flow of dialogue. In this case being Marcille's thoughts when a slime lands on her face and she thinks, and this wording she uses is really key for building an understanding of the concept of resurrection in this world without needing to directly explain it. She talks about her first time dying the same way any regular person would talk about their first time breaking a bone or flying in a plane or shitting their pants, just normal stuff. So this gives us another piece of key information. Death is normal. Now, later on, still in the first episode, Chilchuck delivers this little easy-to-miss throwaway line about corpse retrievers, which aren't really given much explanation, but honestly, just the name corpse retriever should give you enough of a hint as to what this whole thing's about. So we've gotten yet another source of information about dungeon resurrection, still delivered completely within the context of natural dialogue. Now, after this, they find a dead body, and there's some shenanigans, all in good fun. And then finally, near the end of the first episode, Marcille suggests reviving the body with her magic. Laios says no because it could backfire, and then Chilchuck says that they could just leave it there so someone can find it and pick it up later. This was another 10 seconds of natural dialogue that revealed so much information. First, the means through which resurrection is done, through a magic spell. Second, that it's not necessarily as simple and easy as just reviving someone with no consequences. And third, that death and seeing corpses in the dungeon is normalized to the extent that leaving bodies around for people, supposedly the corpse retrievers, to be able to find is a common social practice. And the party's overall reaction to a dead body being more comedic than anything is another hint towards how death is perceived in this world. Now, the way Dungeon Meshi does world building is a lot like building a jigsaw puzzle, piece by piece at a time. Instead of filling in giant chunks all at once like DSIs and other shittier shows, we fill in tiny small chunks at the beginning where the information is delivered via context and inference rather than explicit exposition. And this is how a world is built in the audience's heads over time. The more small pieces get filled in, the clearer of a picture we get of how everything works, which lets us understand and appreciate the story better. Now, in storytelling, when you receive important pieces of information, in a way you kind of need to be prepared to receive it, otherwise it won't really land and stick in your head. Remember earlier when I was talking about the classroom style exposition dumps and how they don't work because they have nothing to latch onto? Well, if you're getting these little pieces of information through natural means, like through regular natural dialogue and character interactions, they become the building blocks that acclimate us to the world. And when more substantial information comes later on, then we're way more prepared to receive it. Like later on in episode 9, we get a much bigger lore drop on the mechanics of resurrection, how it works kind of on a technical level, which only works because we've already kind of been primed and prepared on this stuff. Before getting here, we've already watched people talk about resurrection. We've seen the social impact that it's had on desensitization to death. We've seen how it's created an entire occupation and business focused on finding and resurrecting people. And we've actually seen people die and physically get revived right in front of our eyes. And even right before this explanation, we get some semblance of a political debate, with Senshi arguing that resurrection isn't natural and that he thinks it's an unpleasant sight, which adds even more nuance to the whole thing. We've already seen so much of this world and how resurrection has played a role in shaping it, so dropping the technical explanation at this point is so much more effective than taking the lazy approach and lore dumping right at the start. And of course, resurrection is just one example where we get to see the world building methods of Dungeon Meshi play out, because now we're gonna talk about
racism.
That's right, folks. It's time to talk about fucking racism. Now, just to go over things quickly, the races of the world of Dungeon Meshi, for the most part, just follow the standard D&D/fantasy template races. Humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, etc. But there are some areas where it veers off from the template and differs. The term human is actually made up of a bunch of races. For example, the typical human is called the tall man, while halflings are now called half-foots. They also go even further off the template when we learn more and more about detailed information about each individual race, as well as interactions and relationships between different races. Now, obviously, the first clue we get for all of this is the character designs themselves. Right away, we can see all sorts of different shapes and sizes when it comes to the characters in the show. There's this really good video that there's a pretty good chance that you've already seen before that covers character design in Dungeon Meshi and how it effectively conveys a lot of information through things like body types, clothing, and armor. But in summary, character design is another really immediate and obvious but efficient way to deliver information and world build without needing to do any cheap exposition. There's also natural dialogue to support what each of the characters' roles are in case the designs weren't making that obvious enough. In the first episode, Laios suggests going back to the dungeon by himself, while the camera pans down showing his armor and sword, which is basically telling us, yeah, this guy, he's a tall man and he is the frontliner melee fighter. Marcille and Chilchuck try to persuade him against doing this by telling him how useful their magic and locksmithing skills will be. Again, this is through natural dialogue. There's no like, hey everyone, I'm Laios and this is my party. This is Marcille, who's an elf and our mage, and this is Chilchuck, who's a half-foot and our locksmith. And this is me. I'm a tall man and I'm an absolute fucking freak. I want to fuck all the monsters in the dungeon. Okay, I know I haven't talked about the racism part yet, so I'm gonna get to that. And I want to specifically highlight a few parts that really stood out to me. And a lot of it is centered around the question, what is human? It might seem like a silly question, like, okay, out of all of these people here, probably this guy is the human, right? Well, in the world of Dungeon Meshi, all of these different races fit under the umbrella term of human, except not all the time. It's complicated. Episode 4 is when we get our first real taste of different races not quite getting along. Orcs are introduced for the very first time, and they're killing people. Obviously, that starts us off on a bad note. And we see a lot of hostility throughout the entire episode between Marcel especially and the orc tribe that eventually tries to rob our party before Senshi steps in and strikes a deal with them. But there's just so much nuance that's communicated both directly and indirectly here in their interactions between the party and the orc tribe. Orcs in fantasy stories are usually portrayed as these kind of dumb, stupid, unga-bunga monsters, but here they're more like another type of human, just like all the other races, and there's a lot of nuance to them. And it seems like our main party is actually able to work with the orcs, in this case to make bread. And while everyone's making bread, one of the orcs' children gets curious about what they're doing before his dad starts explaining the violent history surrounding their race and how they were forcibly displaced from their homes into the depths of the dungeon because of humans and elves. And that wording, again, is really important because I just told you, orcs are humans. And elves are also human, so where does this distinction come from? Well, we can probably infer by the way orcs view the other races that they've been essentially alienated and discriminated against. It's not hard to picture, especially based on a lot of real-life history, that even though orcs are humans, there's a lot of people in the world that don't consider them that way. The fact that he says humans and elves also clues us in on a distinct separation between elves and the rest of humanity, at least from the orcs' perspective. The definition of human seems to fit Laios, Chilchuck, and Senshi, but interestingly not Marcel. Marcel also specifically gets targeted with some racist remarks from some of the orcs, which gives us more clues of the animosity between specifically orcs and elves. So this kind of clues the attentive viewers in that there seems to be a perception that elves are kind of special in some way. They're kind of different. We won't fully find out until later, but it's interesting that even here, Dungeon Meshi's dialogue primes us and clues us in on the complexity and the depth of the world, which we've seen plenty from an ecological standpoint with the dungeon ecosystem and all the monsters and all that, but now also from a sociological perspective. Marcel and the orc continue to bicker, and they each shout their own perspectives of history at each other with an impressive amount of racism and stereotyping that is making it very hard to defend Marcel. Please calm the fuck down. You can even see Laios and Chilchuck shifting around and acting kind of nervous and shameful during this conversation, which implies that they're fully aware of this history as well, and they're not proud of it. In the end, the group is able to overcome some of their differences over sharing a meal together, which is nice. And based on the orcs still being willing to help out the party in getting to their next destination, there's one more layer of nuance laid out that there's an understanding that Laios and his party aren't the ones directly responsible for their situation, and that they're still good people worth trusting. But the seeds of conflict over history still clearly remain, and it's clear that this isn't the type of conflict or worldview that can be fixed so easily. There is so much detailed and nuanced information that's covered here, not just straight up history, but also the race relations surrounding it, delivered through a careful choice of dialogue, character behaviors, and even subtle facial expressions. And this is how you paint a picture of a world that's experienced real, serious conflict. But even real, serious conflict isn't all that Dungeon Meshi's races have to offer in the world building. Later on in episode 5, we get to see even more depth when it comes to the races in this world. And it's not the race distinction between tall men, half-foots, elves, etc. It's the races that we would know, like in real life. As in, we're introduced to another group of people, Kabru's party, which is also pretty diverse in terms of races and classes, but we also get Rin, who's fucking Asian. Like me! And Kabru himself is also clearly not a standard European-looking white dude either. There isn't really much in this episode that highlights these race differences, but later on in the story we get a lot of introductions into the Eastern lands and characters who come from there, including Shuro, who's another former member of Laios' party. And while it's obvious that this is essentially this world's version of Japan, there's some more nuance that goes into it too. because of course there is. This isn't in the anime, but there's some side content in the manga that goes into a really interesting conversation between Kaboru and some of the Eastern tallmen characters that directly addresses this question of what is human that I brought up earlier. It talks all about this question from the perspective of people from the East, with two main points being brought up. One, that they have different names for things. So they don't use the term tall men, and instead they just say human. And also they use oni instead of ogre, which is probably brought up from language differences. And two is that the definition of humanity is based on scarcity. They don't have a lot of dwarves or gnomes or elves there, so they don't count them as being human. They even say that they find it weird that they're called tall men here because they're used to being one of the shorter races due to the lack of dwarves and gnomes where they're from. Now, this is side content and it doesn't really follow the natural world building thesis that I've been trying to build up, but it's still a really cool thing that I wanted to bring some attention to as well. Now, one last thing on this topic. I want to highlight yet another thing that I don't see very much in DSIs or other fantasy anime. Plenty of fantasy series deal with conflicts between races, which are often depicted in a really direct and violent way, which of course is really important to portray. But something that Dungeon Meshi gives us too is this kind of thing. In addition to ranked competitive racism, we also get casual racism. This is the kind of shit my dad will tell me when I mention that I want to buy like a new mattress or something. This is what your weird uncle would say at the Thanksgiving dinner table. It's the kind of shit that you just hear people flinging around all the time like it's nothing in real life. But ultimately having this kind of dialogue in your fictional world, even though this is just like a seemingly irrelevant 5-second clip, is an indication of a well thought out world, with tons of nuance and history that shapes even the most mundane and inconsequential of conversations. Only the author of a story that's this well thought out would even bother thinking to include something like this. I used to think that world building was overrated, like who cares about all these random details, I'm here for the plot, I'm here for the characters, but Dungeon Meshi honestly made me take another look at it and changed my mind about how important and impactful world building can be if done right. I also assumed from the start that this would be way more of like a gimmick show. Like the entire thing would just be centered around the one concept of cooking in a dungeon, with every episode featuring a new monster of the week to cook before resetting to the next case. Kinda like Cells at Work, but for dungeon food. But holy shit, did this turn out to be so much more than that. There obviously is a huge focus on cooking and eating dungeon food, and there is a monster of the week kind of thing going on, but each of them ends up being so unique and so interesting, both with how well the dungeon ecosystem is planned and thought out, but also with the way we explore it. I mean, the living armor stuff that I talked about earlier was actually brand new information that Laios discovered himself during the episode, which was really cool to see because they were able to disguise that piece of world building like a mystery with hints and clues scattered throughout the episode. So yes, I guess you could call Dungeon Meshi a show that follows a gimmick, but it's the depth of the world building that makes the gimmick feel really alive. It's the type of show where every tiny detail is relevant, every throwaway line or stupid little gag is either a hint at the history and culture of the greater world or a cleverly disguised important future plot point. So in conclusion, this show is really fucking good, and it makes me feel hungry, so I'm gonna go eat. Bye. Idiot.